must confess that I'm actually quite nervous when I speak anywhere these days. And I'll tell you why through an anecdote. I was addressing a group of environmental foundations in the United States, and I was running through the deep environmental crisis that we face in the world. And I was saying, on forests, every 2 seconds, as we sit here today, a forest the size of a football field will disappear, when we know forests today are not simply beautiful, natural biodiversity spaces, but they're also the lungs of the planet. I went on to say our oceans are under threat and could be dead in 40 years, according to not Greenpeace, but Newsweek, which, as you know, is not a particularly radical left-wing or environmentally friendly publication. And on climate, of course, we are running way behind time, and I'll speak about that. And then at the question time, a very irate member of the audience put up and said, "Dr. Naidoo, have you heard of Martin Luther King?" And I said, "Yes, he inspired me as a young activist in South Africa." And then she said, "Do you know what his most famous speech was called?" And thinking it was a trick question, I very tentatively said, "I have a dream." And she shouted back at me, she said, "Of course it was I have a dream, but when I hear you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare." Right? And part of the challenge of disruption is being willing to say things that actually are not popular. That at the time that you say it, people say, "Wow, that person is crazy." Now, I want to just quickly say that there's also good news, because, and I'm going to disrupt a little bit the TED format, so I'm going to ask you questions, I'm going to ask you to put up your hands. So my first question to you is, how many of you think I would support the statement, "We need to save the planet"? Please put up your hands. Okay, about 3/4 of you. So let me say it to you, to disrupt your thinking. Actually, the planet does not need saving. We do not need to save the planet. Because if we continue the way that we are, with our dependence on fossil fuels, and continue to burn oil, coal, and gas, what will happen? We'll warm up the planet to a point where we'll run out of water, we'll have climate-induced desertification and climate-induced drought, all of which is happening on a significant scale at the moment, and eventually humanity will not be able to exist on the planet. So what will happen? We will be gone, the planet will still be here. And actually, once we get out of the way as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So actually, let's be very clear that the biggest disruption that we need in the world today is around the challenge of climate change. Because the struggle is essentially about whether humanity can disrupt our economics, our politics, and our social sense of what constitutes happiness, such that we can have a mutually interdependent relationship with nature for centuries and centuries to come. Put differently, this struggle is fundamentally about protecting our children and their children's future. My second question. How many of you consider yourself as being well adjusted to society? Please raise your hand. 1, 2. Great, I'm very happy, and you'll see why. We're going to now play a Martin Luther King clip, and you'll see why this question about maladjustment is important.
Modern psychology has a word that is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It is the word maladjusted. It is the ringing cry of modern child psychology, maladjusted. Now, of course, we all want to live the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities. But as I move toward my conclusion, I would like to say to you today, in a very honest manner, that there are some things in our society and some things in our world for which I'm proud to be maladjusted. And I call upon all men of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I must honestly say to you that I never intend to adjust myself to racial segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few and leave millions of God's children smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society.
Let me repeat the last bit for you. I refuse to be well adjusted to the economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty. Let me just extend that a bit. I never intend myself as a human being, as a South African citizen, to adjust myself to the idea that any one person in our country can actually have the right to more than 200 million rand of taxpayer money to build a household for himself when millions of our people are actually left homeless. I never intend to adjust myself to the idea that when cheap, clean, renewable options of energy are available to us, and our government would pursue the idea of nuclear energy when we know that it is too dangerous, that it's too expensive, and as a solution to our energy crisis will deliver too little, too late. So I want to ask you to just stop for a second and think about, in fact, how well adjusted we have become to injustice. When you saw that picture of Kyalami with that informal settlement in Kaya Sands, let's be honest, many of us have actually adjusted to the reality that that's just how things are. But my dear brothers and sisters, if we are to understand the moment of history that we find ourselves in, let's be very clear. We need a completely different mindset. We need to be thinking not simply outside of the box. We have to take the whole box and throw it very, very far away because that box is fundamentally broken. So we have an economic system today that actually is breeding a level of inequality that is completely not only unethical and morally wrong, but actually is fundamentally unsustainable. If all the people in the world were to have the lifestyles that the majority of people in developed countries have and the elites in developing countries do, then we will need between 3 to 5 planets to deliver an average medium lifestyle. So let's not kid ourselves. If we are serious about justice, if we are serious about a sustainable, peaceful world, then we have to disrupt the idea that the current economic system simply needs a little bit of incremental tinkering here and there, but it needs fundamental change. Sorry, just stop that for a sec. So the next quick video I want to show you must be preceded with a question. How many of you believe that the rule of law is a good thing? Put up your hands. Hey.
Depends.
I saw 3 hands went up. People looked around and then 15 hands went up. Okay, so the 3 people disrupted the choice of some others. So Matt Damon fans, you'll be happy to see that there's a clip of Matt Damon that's going to run.
I start from the supposition that the world is topsy-turvy, that things are all wrong, that the wrong people are in jail and the wrong people are out of jail, that the wrong people are in power and the wrong people are out of power, that the wealth is distributed in this country and the world in such a way as not simply to require a small reform, but to require a drastic reallocation of wealth. I start from the supposition that we don't have to say too much about this because all we have to do is think about the state of the world today and realize that things are all upside down. Now, if you don't think, if you just listen to TV and read scholarly things, you actually begin to think that things are not so bad, or that just little things are wrong. But you have to get a little detached and then come back and look at the world, and you are horrified. So we have to start from that supposition that things are really topsy-turvy. And our topic is topsy-turvy, civil disobedience. Now, as soon as you say the topic is civil disobedience, you're saying our problem is civil disobedience. That is not our problem.
Our problem, he goes on to say, is not civil disobedience, but it is civil obedience. That we are obedient as citizens across the world in our multiple countries to far too many things that we should raise up our voices against. He goes on to say in this, by the way, this is not the words of Matt Damon, by the way. Some of you might be thinking, when did Matt Damon become a revolutionary? He's actually reading at a festival to honor a renowned labor historian called Howard Zinn from the United States. But Howard Zinn goes on to say that the rule of law has become the darling of the powerful and the terror to the oppressed and the powerless. If you look at Marikana, if you look at the killing of Andreas Tatane, a name that most of us probably don't remember, from Vicksburg. You might remember he was shot in the demonstration, he was standing, he walked, and he eventually died in front of all of us on national television. That was all in the name of the rule of law. So, part of what we need to understand is that the extent of the challenges that humanity currently faces is so big, is so great, that in fact, it cannot be business as usual. It cannot be the same structures of thinking. It cannot be, for example, the incredible amounts that our governments collectively around the world spend on military expenditure, for example, and then you look what they spend on, say, sanitation. I chose sanitation very consciously because another part of what we must disrupt is the comfortableness that those of us in the middle classes actually feel. So long as our lives are largely okay, then we can have the luxury, sometimes the way it's portrayed, to do a little disruption here and a little bit activism there. But the reality is that today we have reached a point where the climate clock is ticking. It is ticking so fast that some people already are saying, maybe it's too late to avert catastrophic climate change. Now, I would never say that because I'm an optimist, but the reality is that lives are being lost now, infrastructure is being lost, arable land is being lost, water sources are being lost. And when we have this challenge before us, and when our very children and their children's future is at stake, it is incumbent upon us to ask the question, how do we actually change course and change tack and come up with an economic system that is much more aligned to the limitations of nature, and how do we actually get that to work much more harmoniously together? As one of the leaders of the North American indigenous peoples, a Cree leader said, only when the last tree has been chopped, the last river has been polluted, the last fish has been caught, will humanity realize that we cannot eat money. And so what I am saying to you here today, I realize is not stuff that people want to hear, but it is stuff that we need to hear. But I want to say to you, my last question, what do you think is the biggest illness facing humanity today? If you think about various illnesses that we have, which one is most rampant? No guesses? So it's not influenza, but actually it is affluenza. Because I think the fact that 1% of the people control more than 65% of the wealth in the world, and that same statistic plays itself out at national levels, is an indication not of success, but of a pathology, of a real sickness where people actually believe that happiness comes from more, bigger, bigger. Right? And we have to challenge ourselves about whether in fact the integrity of what we say, right, is all that powerful if we ourselves are not connecting our lives to the realities of the people in whose names we say we are seeking to serve and in whose names often we raise money. So I want to just conclude quickly by saying that for us as Africans on this continent, we need to realize that the future of this continent is not going to be improved by the way we currently do things. We have to push for greater social, economic, and political integration, because many of the countries on our continent actually make no economic, cultural, linguistic, environmental, or any other sense. But it's a reality we have to deal with. You know, the boundaries of this continent was drawn up at a conference in Berlin in the Scramble for Africa. So one of the slogans that I'm using quite often these days is, if Europe can have a euro, why can't Africa have an afro? And I'm not talking about the hairstyle, okay? So what I'm saying is that on every aspect, from local to global, we have to start creating the space to imagine and dream and think about things much more differently. But in the way we get to it, I want to conclude with this story. The way we get to it, we also have to disrupt the way we think about how people change, about what constitutes courage, what constitutes sacrifice, and so on. So I want to leave you with a little story of a mutual friend of my brother and I, very close friend, called Lenny, who, when we were fleeing into exile in 1987, asked me a question the last time I would see him before we fled into exile. He said, "What is the biggest contribution we can make to the cause of humanity?" And I said, "Giving your life." And he said, "No, that's not the right question. It's not giving your life, but giving the rest of your life." And my friend Lenny, because at that time, every weekend we were at funerals burying comrades who were being killed and so on, right? And so becoming a martyr was something that was talked about as the biggest, sacrifice you could make. And he challenged that. And we hugged each other, we went to the exile in different directions, and 2 years later I get the call that Lenny and 3 young women from my home city, Durban, were brutally murdered by the Apartheid regime. There were so many bullets in the bodies, the parents couldn't recognize them. I had to think deeply about the distinction that he was making between giving your life and giving the rest of your life. It's a very important distinction. Essentially what he was saying, the struggle for justice, whether it's economic justice, social justice, climate justice, gender justice, these struggles are marathons, they're not sprints. And the biggest contribution that any one of us can make is to have the courage to think in bold and substantially transformative ways on the one end, but also to have the courage, the perseverance, and the stamina to stay with it until those injustices or challenges have been eradicated. If there's one message you want to take away from this little talk, is that the struggle for justice is a marathon, not a sprint, and we need more and more people who are willing to disrupt the current status quo and to have the stamina to stay with it until justice is achieved in what is a fundamentally unjust world, continent, and country. Thank you very much.